Tonight we're going to talk about paper, writing, and writing instruments. And as you all know, I collect fountain pens, so I have a natural attraction to this whole area. But it dawned on me that there's a lot of things that I know and take for granted that most people don't know. And it's very interesting. Not to be boring, but like the history of paper. Paper was first invented by the oldest civilization on earth, the Chinese, about 105, at the same time that Hadrian was running around in Rome. And he, I mean, the Chinese invented it, but didn't do anything with it, really. Just like gunpowder. They invented it, but then when it came time to use it, they were making firecrackers and people were shooting bullets at them. But paper making and really didn't start until the 10th century, and that was in Europe. And it was really first on the Iberian Peninsula, which is like Portugal and Spain, and it was done by the Muslims, as the ones that first developed a way to make paper out of different materials. And the first materials that were made were not what we would call paper. They were natural fibers like papyrus, which was the pith part of a certain plant, or palm leaves, or parchment. Does anybody know what parchment is? Where it comes from? Yeah.
A tree.
It's actually sheepskin.
Oh, sheep.
Now, parchment today has been modernized and it's really not sheepskin, but the real stuff. You may have heard like a diploma talked about as a sheepskin because they were printed on parchment. But those things were expensive and they were in limited supply, and you know, they couldn't like print out 1,000 sheets or whatever. So it was very limited, but you have to remember from where they came. And it was a great advancement when they started making things that they could write on rather than like the walls of a cave or something. So this was a big advancement, and it was in the 10th century. And then it continued to progress and evolve, and then in the about in the 14th century, it was somebody figured out how to make it on using paper, what we call paper today, which was a combination of either old rags or wood pulp. And it made it possible to make things that you could, the process of actually manufacturing paper became more portable than it had been before. So they were able to produce more, and it grew and grew and grew. There are, you may have heard the term laid paper, L-A-I-D. Well, laid paper was where you took the pulp that you're going to make the paper out of and pour it in a mold. That's basically what laid paper is. The process of doing that by hand made it a limited production kind of thing. And the materials, there are different ways of doing this. If you just take, like, sometimes you'll see paper that's 25% rag, or 100% rag, or 100% cotton, or 25%, different percentages. And those are better papers than papers that are like made for laser jet printers and that kind of thing. Those kind of papers don't have any of that content. It's just wood pulp. And the pulp is bleached so that it makes it white. And when you drive through Evadale, that's really what you're smelling, is the sulfur emissions caused by when they're bleaching the paper pulp. Now, paper has a finish to it. And you think, well, paper's paper, but let me pass around some things. These are, this kind of paper has kind of almost a stone texture to it. And when you get it, hold it up to the light, and you'll see what's called a watermark. Watermark is like who made the paper, what kind of paper it is. And this is a very important thing when it comes to art, because when an important edition of an artist was put on the paper, like a print, serigraph, or whatever, it's put on a certain kind of paper. So somebody copying, doing a fraudulent copy of it is not going to have access to that particular paper, so they're going to use something else. But if you hold it up and look at the watermark and you know what the watermark is supposed to be for that edition, then you know right away, first of all, if it's the right watermark, say, well, this might be real. Or if it's not on there at all, you say, well, this is definitely not real. So it's a good tool for identifying original works. This is another piece of paper. You look at this one and you can see the words Statesman script, 100% cotton. But when you look at it, as well as these others, you can see not just the watermark, but you can also see lines. Oh, yeah. And there's vertical lines and horizontal lines. And that's typically what's called a laid, L-A-I-D, paper. And originally, those lines were made by the screens that they used to press the pulp down. No more. It's all kind of fakey now. They have a roller they run through it, and it makes those marks and puts the watermark in the paper. But it's like a roller, like a rolling pin type, basically. It's got that pattern on it, and they roll it into the pulp so that it makes those marks into the paper. You can't feel them, but it's a sign of a better paper. Obviously, if they went that extra step, more labor involved, more costly. Especially if it's watermarked paper. Did y'all see the watermarks? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now this is a paper, it's heavy, much heavier. Paper modern paper is identified by weight. You have 20-pound paper, 28-pound paper, 10-pound paper. And it's the weight of how much a ream of that paper weighs. And so obviously a 28-pound paper is a better quality paper than a 10-pound paper. Most laser paper, the copy paper that you buy, just cheap stuff that you run through, is about 20-pound paper. I use for my own self, I only buy 28-pound paper because I just like the feel of it in my hands. It's just a heavier paper. But this is a 60-pound paper, and it's often used for cards and heavier things like the front of a folder, or maybe a brochure, or maybe a company financial statement will have heavy paper on the front, that kind of thing. So it's often called card stock because it's heavier. But again, it's just the weight of the paper. And the way the paper's made, basically, and it's real simple, you can make paper at home. You take a tub, like a Tupperware tub, you take a screen, a frame, like an old picture frame or something like this, and put a piece of screen wire on it. And then you get a blender, get some scrap paper, and other things that I'll tell you in a second. But for instance, if you wanted to make your own paper, you take a piece of junk mail, tear up the envelope, put it in the blender, cover it with water, turn the blender on. It emulsifies it. You take that, you take this screen, put it in the bucket, the tub of water, no chemicals. Put it in the tub of water, pour that stuff out of the blender into the tub of water. And then you use your fingers, kind of mush it around and kind of give it even. And then you lift that screen out, put it on a piece of blotter paper, basically, and then put another piece of blotter paper on top of it. You blot the water out. And that emulsion that you've made turns into your sheet of paper.
You can see that.
Oh, yeah.
Because I've seen that paper in certain artists in Mexico or that are doing their own paper, and they say handmade paper, that they have made their paper to
there are 5 or 6 sheets
How does that color? Do they color it?
in this little packet.
They paint.
They're all different. Some of them are very fragile. But these are for you to keep. These are all handmade papers.
This is
And you see some of them are unbleached, like the one on the front.
We have one of that paper, made hand paper of Rufino Tamayo's work.
great.
at home.
Do you? I'm not
Next I will show
surprised. I'm
you.
sure
But
you
there's
do.
different things you can do.
We'd love to see it.
Yes.
We'd love an
By the way, these papers
demonstration.
mostly come from India. There's one that comes from China, but you'll notice, you see how this one is tissue? It's made exactly the same way as these are made. It's just less pulp. And this, well, you see this one's got little specks and pieces in it. This one really, I got this one to show you especially because it's got flower petals, pieces of stems. You can take, when you're making the paper, and you put the scrap paper in the blender, you can put leaves, you can put oil, perfume, you can put coloring. Like if you want all your paper to be pink, just buy some acrylic pink paint, put it in there, and it's almost limitless what you can do. And then depending on how chunky it is, depends on what you can do with it. I mean, you couldn't write, while you could write on most of this with a ballpoint pen, you probably couldn't write on it with a fountain pen because the looseness of the fibers would suck the ink into it and bleed into the ink, into the paper. So there's some things you can't do with it, but the interesting thing is that literally, you can make a sheet of paper, you get this stuff together, you can make a sheet of paper in 3 minutes. Very interesting. Because, you know, then you can, you know, make special envelopes or boxes and just note cards. It's fascinating and it's limitless, really. You could do any, you put in, instead of just paper, you want to put in shredded rags into that blender.
No.
You know, that's what 25% rag paper is. It's got 25% cotton rag. And that's a much better paper than papers without it. Rag paper is stronger.
It absorbs, you know, it's very absorbent. So nice.
So the different finishes, we got the laid finish, we've got a wove, W-O-V-E finish. Now, wove finish is not, you think that's woven looking, right? No. Wove means it's a smooth finish. It's a standard term. You can keep those. But it's a standard term in the industry. Laid and wove are industry standards. If you go to the store today to buy stationery and you want different finishes for different things. Like for really nice stationery, you'd want probably a laid or a linen finish, which has a look of woven linen. And then there's I know you've seen what's called a granite finish. And it's grayish and it has little black specks in it. And it's just the way of finishing the paper with color like that to make it look like a piece of granite.
And there are papers that have kind of a texture. When you touch the cards of some people, ones are very, go like that, for example. But other ones, you feel like a texture. That makes a difference in what? Quite sometimes you have the feeling, a different feeling in the cards, for example.
Now this is a good example.
What makes
this
the
is some
difference?
paper that I had made from my own correspondence in Florence, Italy. Now you feel this.
Yes, I wanted to know.
And look at the watermark. Look at it's obviously handmade paper. Now when you use paper like this, first of all, it's a pleasure to use it. But secondly, anybody that has, most people, they get this in their hand and they know it's special.
Yes, you can see the
They know it's
difference.
not just ordinary paper.
No.
So it's kind of a nice way to express your personality or enjoy the finer things in life. It's just appreciate different things.
It's more expensive, obviously, or not?
It's not that expensive.
I just want to have all this curiosity. How do they make the difference?
That's the company that made it. Yeah. It's called Parioni.
I love this paper.
So, you know, and the way they make it, it's very, you know, probably 20 sheets and then 20 envelopes. It's really classy.
Yeah.
I go to, every time I go to Florence, Italy, I go
Leave it to the Italians.
I just soon go here as you know, the Uffizi. All right. So that's pretty much an overview of paper. You can see it's a lot of different kinds. The finishes are important. Now, when I buy paper, because I write with a fountain pen a lot, I always test the paper with my pen. Because some papers, even expensive papers, will bleed with fountain pens. Especially old fountain pens, because the nibs sometimes tend to cut the fibers of the paper. And I hate papers that the ink bleeds into. I just cringe. So I always test it. I always sign my name real fast with my own pen so I can tell if it's going to bleed or not. They look at me like I'm crazy, but
No, but
this
it
used to be
wouldn't
very
look-
common.
Yes,
Nowadays,
I'm sure. It wouldn't be pretty or attractive.
No.
if it bleeds.
no, it's fuzzy looking. Okay, so that's paper. And the next thing I want to talk about is writing. Now, the original writing system, the first time there was ever a system of writing, was in Mesopotamia. And I had to look that up. I read it in the Bible, but I wasn't sure where it was. That was what's now Iraq and Syria and Kuwait. It's kind of that valley between those two rivers, the Euphrates and whatever.
And Tigris.
Yeah. And that was 3500 BC, and it was actually an accounting language. It was for keeping track of money. So it evolved through different ways, and I'm going to talk about the different kind of writing instruments that it evolved through in just a minute. But I want to talk about handwriting itself. And I'm going to just go back to the 19th century. In the 19th century, when more and more people were becoming literate, and people were writing more, it was very time-consuming to sit down and write a letter or a legal document or an agreement or a treaty, something like that. So they had scribes. But even so, it was tedious. So several people recognized this, but the most important one was a guy named Spencer. And he recognized that they needed a way to write fluently, fast, but legible, and, if possible, attractive. So you may have heard of the term Spencerian script. Well, that's where it comes from, was this guy Spencer, and this was back in the mid-1800s. And what he did was he looked at all the different script styles that were out there, and he kind of brought them together and made a plan, a teaching plan for teaching people how to write this way. And in script, the thing that identifies it as opposed to a technical writing or a block printing type writing is that the letters, most of them are connected. So theoretically, you write faster because it was one movement. And it caught on. It became taught. First, it was taught in his own schools, and then he published books about how to teach yourself. And it grew and grew and grew until, and it was until probably 1910. It was the thing that was taught. You had to learn Spencerian script, whether you were anybody who went to school had to learn this. This is the way you wrote. Well, then about 1910, a guy named Palmer came along. And I know you all remember this. You remember? Now, John may not. But you remember in the front of the school, you had the blackboard, and over the top of it, you had these letters.
Oh, yeah,
Those were Palmer script letters. Because that's what you were taught to fashion your letters like. It was a simplified version of Spencerian. So that's kind of the evolution of writing the way we think of it today. And it's not just here in the West, or in England or America. The Chinese have their own version of cursive writing. The Greeks, Germans. It's not just limited to our language, and it's a way. I mean, you can read a printed word and a handwritten word in script, and you know it's the same word, but it doesn't look the same. And the same thing's true of these other languages. Interesting.
It's an art.
The logo for Ford Motor Company and the logo for Coca-Cola are both Spencerian script. Goes back that far.
Really?
And this, by the way, is super fragile. The paper is very brittle. But this is it's called Real Penwork, Self-Instructor and Penmanship. It was published in 1881. And These things are rare. I mean, they're, anytime they come on the market, I just stumbled across this one because I wouldn't pay the price for what they normally sell for. I bought this, you know, they had $20 on it. That's a stretch, but I'll take it. But I want to show you, combined with penmanship is this idea of flourishing. And I'm going to get over to that. See, this is some exercises about how to slant your letters, how each letter is formed, a description, like a scientific description of the formation of the letters, the different strokes. I'm sorry, Malcolm, I'm trying. This is just the alphabet. And this is Spencerian script. Atlanta. I don't think it makes sense. It's just letters.
Was that what the Constitution was written?
Promissory note? No.
The Constitution was written in,
Oh, yeah.
in Spencerian?
Well, no.
No.
That was written before Spencerian script, but it's a flourishing script, and we're going to get into flourishing later, just in a few pages here. The flourishing is taking your pen, and this shows the stroke. You see the arrows? This shows you the strokes involved, but look what happens when you start learning the strokes. Here's the strokes to make this bird. I'm going to find a really good example to show you. So here's different color inks, but now a lot of this stuff was done without taking the pen off the paper. I've watched it, I've studied it. I couldn't do this. But you see, you have to have a nib in your pen that will write both very fine and very wide.
That's beautiful.
And it is beautiful.
It's like an art, you know, to me. To get to
And see,
do
all
something
this
like
is
that.
done with pen strokes. Every bit of it.
It's what pen stroke?
Just different pen strokes.
That's incredible.
Here's a bunch of people's faces, even with, you know, recognizable characteristics, all done with pen strokes. It was really fascinating. It was very popular in the Victorian period. I'm going to step over here for just a second and grab
Text and telephone, typewriters.
Now this is just some private correspondence because I write to different penmen, different people, and you can just see just the envelopes, some of the penmanship on the envelopes.
Oh, look at that. Oh. There are people
Oh,
who
yes.
know how to
Oh,
write.
yes, and I always manage to do less than good. Penmanship is not good.
People have been practicing. Oh, look. What is that? That's not
That's Old English.
Old English. Look at that one.
See, I got hooked on letters when I was like in the 5th or 6th grade. And I saw an Old English letter and I was fascinated by it. So ever since then, I've kind of collected alphabets. So it's always been an interest to me.
These are beautiful.
They really dedicate time.
That's Michael's
They
invitation.
dedicate time.
Her wedding
And concentration to do that.
I knew I noticed that's Michael's wedding
Yeah,
invitation.
I thought the penmanship was worth keeping.
Did you do this?
I
know.
And it was all taped. So you had to learn the correct way to hold the pen staff. Torture.
When I was little at school, the teachers hold your hand to write correctly to make it. I remember that.
And woe be to the poor child that was left-handed.
The ruler.
Poor me.
Oh.
They didn't say funny. They did.
We'll probably make them change.
Okay.
their nose with smack their hands.
So we've talked about paper and about the history of writing. And now I want to talk about
Recorded now.
the writing instruments.
Writing this.
Now, originally, writing instruments are what we would think of as engraving. They would take a chisel and carve into stone, then later into lead or into wax tablets, things like that. And that's called, fancy here, autonomous writing instruments, which means the instrument itself is all you have to make the mark, as opposed to assisted writing instruments, which means you have to add something to it to make it work, like ink or lead for a pencil. So you have the autonomous kind, which is like a chisel. They don't have you're not adding pigment, but like for instance, if you wanted to write on a cave wall and you had a piece of charcoal, that would be autonomous. Then you had writing with pigment that was, well, for instance, the term lead pencils come from the fact that they actually started out as lead pencils, and they would write on a certain type of surface with that lead. And that's where we get the name, because there's no lead in a lead pencil. Then, of course, chalk in schoolrooms, wax pencils, and those are all, pretty elemental. Then you move into what we call pens, and you have different types. And this really started with the feather, where you would take a quill feather and cut it a certain way and dip it into some kind of ink, and then make your marks on paper and then dip it again. All right, well, that was how it started. And those pens were called dip pens for obvious reasons. And that's what these are here. As the 19th century evolved, they got more and more fancy, and you moved away from the quills into what was called a dip pen, where you actually could close it up, put it in your pocket. It did not have its own ink. You had to dip it in ink. That's why it's still called a dip pen. And then you write with it. And all of these, that's what all of these are. This is a typical type that does not retract. It's just the pen staff with the nib. And you dipped it, wrote with it, however many words your ink would carry, and dip it again. And that's why a lot of the old writings you'll see have splotches of ink on them, because these just do that.
Yeah.
and
They do.
You'll see some important documents sometimes with splotches on them. Just a blot, looks like a spider or something. But then this nib would be, you could pull it out if it got bent, put another one in. It was kind of an advancement over the feather.
And when did they use these?
These were 19th century, from about 1860 to about 1890, 95.
That's beautiful.
I've seen in the
And they got fancier and fancier. They did different things, but most of them retracted so that a lady could carry them in their reticule, or the gentleman could carry them in their vest pocket. They would also have to carry what was known at the time as an ink horn, which was at first was actually a horn off of a small ram that they hollowed out and made a seal for, like a cork, and they would put their ink in it, and that's how they carried their ink.
Where'd they get that in?
They would make it out of oak gall and carbon, basically. Different things, but that's basically how ink was made.
What was it again?
Oak gall.
Gall.
Please don't ask me what that is.
Okay.
That's what I was going to
I
ask
don't
you.
remember.
And carbon, you said.
Carbon,
Okay.
but there was iron in it, and sometimes you'll see some very old writing that actually looks like it's rusted. It's because of the iron, and naturally it corroded the points, so that's why points were interchangeable. And the point was really the most important part of the pen, because that determined the quality and beauty of your line.
What did they use the quills? Where did they get those? I mean, I know they're feathers.
Well, there are certain kind of feather.
Okay.
The best ones, I think, came from crows, but also swans, and there's bound to be other birds as well. But it wasn't a simple matter of plucking the quill out and cutting
Yeah.
and starting to write. It had to be a certain quill, a certain part of the body of the bird, and then you had to be skilled at cutting that point. And I know you've all heard, I've probably told you all this before, but the old pocket knives originally were called pen knives because they were used to trim these quills. And sometimes they would split the quill so the point, instead of just being a solid point, had a split in it. It would hold more ink so they could write a few more words with it. But they wore, so they were constantly to write a while and okay, slice it off again and write some more. So, I mean, and everybody did. That was the only way really to write with ink. After you did that, though, you had to harden it. And the best way to do it was with sand that was heated over a fire. They would take a tray of sand, heat it over the fire, and then they would put the pin in the nib into it and let it cool off. And it would harden that quill so that you could actually use it for a length of time without it just coming apart on you.
Interesting.
So,
Didn't they also put sand on, after they wrote on the piece of letter, did the sand kind of make the ink dry? Or
no,
something?
that's a different sand. But thank you for bringing that up. That's called Ponce, P-O-N-C-E. And I know you've seen period movies where this guy with the frilly shirt's writing, and he's writing, then he takes something that looks like sand salt shaker, and then he dusts it off. Well, that stuff he's using is called Ponce. And what it does, it's like an absorbent. And they put it over the wet ink because these things put down a lot of ink, and they stay wet a good while. You'd have to either just lay it out to dry for 10 minutes, or you could do this and then pick the paper up, dust it off, and it'd be pretty much ready to go.
Like blotting it over.
Right. It's like blotting it, but without taking the chance of smearing the ink. And a lot of times, the Ponce was shaken off and recollected because it was reusable. And there were different materials that were used for that, but it's all called Ponce. All right. So as the dip pen evolved to very fine, solid 18-karat gold things that only very wealthy people could have, but this was the height of this kind of writing instrument. And then a set like this, where you'd have a pen holder, which held the nib, and then you would have a lead holder, which held a piece of lead. So you had a pencil and a pen, and then this was engraved with your coat of arms or your initials, and you would seal your wax envelope shut with this. So this was a normal thing to see in the 19th century. It was also something that obviously you didn't carry around with you. It was on your desk. And sometimes you'll notice in the old movies from that period that probably wouldn't notice it, but people, when they were writing, especially ladies, would put on white cotton gloves. And it was because ink went everywhere. And it was to keep their fingers from staining. So, but the problem was they didn't carry their own ink supply. And that was a real problem, especially as commerce started catching up. And you had business, and you had people that had to, sign contracts and do all this kind of stuff. And that's when people, the Waterman Company was the first one to do it. He developed, and he was an insurance salesman, and he was tired of carrying his ink around to get people to sign contracts. He came up with the first fountain pen. A fountain pen, by definition, is something that has its own fountain of ink with it. And there are lots of different mechanisms for putting the ink and carrying it with them, but they're all called fountain pens. Whether it had a little lever, whether it's the kind I collect that you unscrewed and took an eyedropper and filled it up, screwed it back together, or whether it uses a plunger like Mont Blanc does, or there's dozens of different filling mechanisms. And basically they're all gimmicks to identify one pen maker supposedly over another. But the whole idea, though, is that a pen could carry its own ink, so you could put it in your pocket, you could travel to Silsbee and sign a contract for 1 million tons of lumber, not have to have all this paraphernalia with you. So in the early 1900s, it also became important to carry a pen. And I may have mentioned this before because I find it fascinating, but men would carry pens in their coat pockets as a symbol that they were literate, because less than 20% of the population was literate. So it was a status symbol. And at first, all the fountain pens were black. And then somebody came along in the early teens, I guess about 1915, somewhere around there, and developed a way of mixing red and black together, which made it a little more visible. And they finally came up with solid orange-red pens, which were even more visible. And then there's one called a mandarin yellow pen that was made by Parker. And when they hit the market, just the color sold it, because it was visible. People would know, that guy's smart, he knows how to write. And so it became an important thing. And now, we evolved from like right before World War II, there was people that started trying to figure out how to make a ballpoint pen. And the first person to ever patent one, last name was Biro, B-I-R-O, was from Spain. And then they started bringing it out in a Frenchman, and his last name was spelled B-I-C-H. And, I don't know how I know how it's pronounced, but what they did was they changed he came up with a cheap way to make these things. And they're still being made today. It's a Bic pen. And it's the same technique. They look like a pencil. That's how he started. So that the fountain pen evolved out of necessity to carry ink supply with you from a dip pen. And then the ballpoint was so that you didn't have ink leaking on you. So the first ballpoints, ink did leak on you. That's why they were a failure. And then after World War II, they developed ways to make the ink so that it would stay in that little tube and not run all out over your clothes and so forth. But you probably don't remember, but even in the early days of air flight, many ballpoint pens leaked in cabin pressure. It was not a smart thing to carry a pen on a plane. It's still not a fountain pen that has a bladder. Now, a bladder is like a little balloon that's inside the barrel of a pen, and all the old pens, the first fountain pens all had bladders. So you would depress that bladder, put it in the ink, let go of it, it would suck the ink up, and that was how you filled your pen. Now they use print pens with screw things that you force the air out, put it in the ink, and unscrew it, it sucks the ink back up, so there's nothing to collapse under pressure. So you can carry those on a plane. But anyway, even the first ballpoints, you couldn't carry on a plane because the ink was that sensitive. And of course, other than pens, there's brushes and pencils. As I touched on a minute ago, the first pencils were what we would call lead pencils were actually sticks of lead that they wrote on things with. So, I want to slip back into a minute into writing. Did anybody ever take any classes where you had to write with a speedball? Speedball was kind of a generic pen that had different widths and different shapes of the nib, and you would dip it and be able to write different types of lines. And most calligraphy writing is taught by using speedballs. That's just the brand name. Hunt actually made them, but Speedball was their trade name for this kind of pen. And they were immensely popular, and still are. You can still buy them. Now, they've merged with a company called Osmeroid. It's actually a fountain pen that has most of those nib selections that you can interchange and write with. But back in the 30s, a company in Germany, Pelikan, which is still in business, but they made a pen called a Graphos. And it's in this little fabric-covered wooden box. And it has this little pin. You shut the box, shove this thing in, and it locks the box so it doesn't come open. And then you open it by pulling that pin out. And you've got a pen staff There's nothing but a holder. You take that off, and you screw that on the end, and then all these different pen types. You see from needle point to very wide point, and different shapes, round and straight, and so forth. Can you see that? And you would pick one that you wanted that type of writing, and then you would fasten it in this holder. There's a little clip there. You slide it down just right. Get all the two clips in
It's so
place,
difficult to write.
and then you would dip it.
It takes so much time.
But you had a
Oh,
portable
yeah.
speedball set. The other thing was pretty cumbersome. And then all this mechanism on the back is just to make it hold a little more ink, so that you weren't dipping it, every 5 seconds. So there've been a lot of
It changed.
the writing instrument world is fascinating with its stories of one-upmanship and lawsuits and no, I invented that. No, I invented that. And then their competition was intense among pen makers because you buy a pen and it works. Why do you need to buy another one? So they had to create a demand. The way you create a demand is make something new. Well, this is the best filling mechanism ever. And they were doing this all the way up through the 60s. There's a pen that came out by Parker in the 60s called the 61 because it came out in 1961. And it's the weirdest filling mechanism I've ever heard of. You take the pen and you put it in the bottle of ink and you wait so many seconds and take it out. It absorbs the ink up into some kind of filament inside the
Magic.
ink. Now, I repair pens, but I won't touch one of those because I don't know how they work. But there's so many filling mechanisms out there. And it's all because from the paper, and paper exists because they needed a way to write down and make a record of things and pass it on to other generations and make it as indelible as possible. And obviously, we ran out of caves a long time ago, so we had to have something else. But that's as brief as I can make this history, and I hope I've made it interesting.
Very interesting.
Very well.
Really,
So writing was developed before they even had anything to write on, but they used clay, cuneiform tablets, or walls or whatever. And then from that went the sheepskin or the rolls like in the biblical Old Testament.
Papyrus first.
Papyrus in that area.
What's called pamphlet, which is, I think, about the same thing.
So they were writing over in the Tigris Euphrates in Egypt, but they weren't doing much but cave writing over in Europe, right? Probably.
Well, yes, yeah. It really, civilization kind of evolved in that
And
cradle.
then when
The Akkadians were one of the oldest. The Akkadians used to eat clay, to make their marks.
the what?
The Akkadians.
Akkadians?
Yes.
And see, what happened was, when they first started using clay tablets, they were not fired.
And they
Oh.
And the
know
only
melted.
samples we have
very little.
left
No, because of
are
that.
ones that were in a fire
Hmm.
by accident.
Yeah, preserved.
Oh,
And the
yeah.
fire hardened the clay
know
and
that.
preserved it.
Mhm.
That's the oldest
know.
writing on clay that we have. Later they learned, if you're going to preserve it, you got to put it together.
It's very hard.
But it's fascinating when you think about it.
Yes.
We take it for granted.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you write, and if you're like me, your handwriting's not real pretty unless you take your time. But it's been a long process of evolution of finding the materials and the techniques and things to share ideas and pass knowledge along from one generation to another.
Do you think we're regressing?
Well,
We're
it's changing
regressing
definitely.
because
I mean,
Nobody is
now
writing?
they're saying that actually the physical act of handwriting is not necessarily important anymore because we have a keyboard, and the keyboard skills are as important or even more important than handwriting skills. And then there's a lot of us that don't feel that way, but I can appreciate that that's a fact, and you can't run from technology. You just going to get it run over. You have to go with it, but you can still enjoy good papers and a good pen and write personal notes. I mean, who doesn't like to get a personal note?
That's what I was just thinking. I love it when I get a letter.
I mean, send me an email or a text, and but a handwritten note is you know.
But Dexter, you know, the writers, before the typer machine and all that, you know, when they had to write their books, but still with that, it took such a long time for them to write a book, really, a novel, something like that, a biography. So in a way, we are very lucky that we have certain things to write faster, you know? And you can
And I have an
more
app
and more and
on
more.
my cell phone. I can't remember what it's called, but you just take a picture of writing and it converts it into text. Takes it from being a picture to text. Fascinating.
No, I know, but the writers, I mean, you know, how for them it is the real novelists, I say, you know, when they have to write so many books, you know, and they are so productive, so talented at the same time, that they need, you know, otherwise there will be many books in their bodies when they die. You know, in that way we have the books
What
now.
a nice and interesting way to say that. Anybody else have any questions or
What's
observations?
the oldest brand name of writing instrument that you have
Wow.
today? Is Parker Water?
Well, in America, it's Waterman.
Okay.
But there's, he's the one that invented it here in this country. And I don't know if they predate some of the Italian companies and German companies like Pelican and Mont Blanc and Aurora in Italy, and there's 3 or 4 of them in Italy that are quite old. But I'm not sure. But I think because Waterman's actually the first one that invented the technique of doing it, that he's probably the oldest, and that was in the late 1800s. And the first attempt at, I mean, we all know what a cartridge pen is. Plastic cartridge, plug it in your pen, use it up, throw it away. Of course, I'm too cheap. I don't throw them away. I fill them up with a syringe and use them again. Why buy another one? But the first one was made with a pig bladder because rubber hadn't been invented. I mean, they would try to make things out of natural rubber, but the process of making it actually hardens it, made it unusable. So they came up with this idea. It didn't work, but it was actually a patented thing in the United States. And then I think it was Waterman that came up with the first fairly reasonable cartridge pen, and the cartridge was glass. And I've seen a few of those. Just a clear tube of glass, like a test tube or something like that, that fit inside the barrel of the pen. You know, not too practical because glass.
Yes.
So, anybody else have any?
Very
I thought about
interesting.
having, I played with the idea of actually making some paper tonight.
She knows how to do that. She was telling me, you have a screen and a...
No, I don't know. I have artists at home with papers that they have done their work in their own paper.
Oh,
When you buy this, it's handmade paper that they have made their paper too.
I see.
It's really easy.
But you don't have
Yeah.
the...
Well,
But
that's
I
what I
have the
discovered
piece
when I
of
was
art
researching
with the
this.
handmade
How easy
paper.
it is.
Oh, with the handmade.
Yes,
Oh,
of the
okay.
artist. Yes.
I'm disappointed. I thought you were at home making your own
No,
paper.
I would love to.
It's
I was
interesting
going to want to
that
come see that.
you can do that.
Yes, but you
And
can
then
see
you
the
can
art.
play
You
with
have to
the
have
designated
handmade
blender
paper.
for that.
Yes.
And then you
You might
can,
as well
after
throw
you're
that
done, you
on.
can
Yeah, really.
Designated blender.
not only get the moisture out, but the
It's
flatness.
newspaper.
Choose paper.
Now, I did want to show you a paper here.
You can't imagine
This is a
scraping
paper
all
I
that.
learned in Italy, and I've never seen it anywhere else. Crane comes close, but they don't. It's not the same. This paper is one of the most elegant papers I've ever written on, and it actually has a clay surface.
Please.
Clay.
It has what? Clay? It's beautiful.
The name of the company is Pinador, and they have shops all over Florence. And you know, it's
Oh.
like a real high-end stationery. You can buy little packets of envelopes and writing paper, and it's just really elegant. It's just nice. I mean, it's a pleasure to write. And then you combine this with a pen. It's almost like an artist using a brush, and it's just
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, I guess so. That's beautiful.
So many things in Florence.
Uh-huh,
Like that.
uh-huh.
Oh, paper, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, this kind of work that you've seen a lot of probably
Oh,
is,
yes.
is from
Uh-huh,
Florence.
yeah.
And you go over there and you see this a lot
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
in note cards and thank you cards and all that
And
kind
their
of stuff.
little
This is,
boxes a lot of times have that
Mhm.
design that they sell.
and it's known as Florentine paper.
Beautiful.
It's more of a tourist thing than really good.
Sure, but it's
But
better.
it's pretty.
Huh?
But it's pretty.
It's beautiful. We don't get it here.
You know, if you're in the publishing industry, the most expensive parts of your book are your paper printing and binding. And you know, paper, ink, and the binding. And a lot of times what we would do is we would buy paper enough because the price would fluctuate so much. You have to buy these huge amounts and you have to find a place to store them. But it would influence so much the price of the book that you would, when it was low, you buy it from Denmark or Sweden or somewhere, just tons of
Makes sense.
paper fluctuates, goes up and down. And, you can't do that to the price of the book. But you know, it's going to cost you $30, $32. You can't say, well, now it's $33 because the price went up and
Mhm.
stuff.
Yes.
Plus the
It's
future.
a side of it you don't think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
I bet it has to be stored in certain conditions too.
It would, and when this was, Picture City was fairly dry, so there wasn't too much of a problem. But yeah, you had to protect it.
Well, I see these big rolls of paper that they make up there at, I don't know what the name is anymore. It used to be East Tex Paper Mill in Evadale. With these great big things, so they would, at that time, you'd see them on trucks going to Houston, because the Houston Chronicle bought all of their paper
Mm-hmm.
from them to print their paper, their newspapers. I don't know what's happening nowadays. Gigantic rolls of paper,
Oh, wow.
and they're heavy.
Well, you would buy it by the weight. You know, you want a 20 or 18, whatever it is that you want in the book that you're doing, you would get that type of paper, and that would influence the cost, what it costs you to produce the book.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you
That was
very
good.
much. That's really nice.
Very interesting.
That will be recorded.
Yes.